responses.
Well, the hell, I'm dead if I can find anything wrong with it.
No 9,000 computer has ever made a mistake.
Days after the most talked-about film of 1968 opened in cinemas, its director did something almost unheard of. Stanley Kubrick sat down with 2001, A Space Odyssey, the film he had spent years building, and cut roughly 19 minutes out of it. The footage he removed was thought, for decades, to have been destroyed on his orders. Then it reappeared in perfect condition, in a vault inside a salt mine, and the studio decided you would never see it. This is the story of the parts of 2001 that were filmed, recorded, and then erased: the lost minutes, the abandoned score, and the prologue that no longer exists. 2001, A Space Odyssey premiered in early April 1968. The version shown that night ran roughly 2 hours and 40 minutes, a slow, near-silent, deeply strange piece of cinema, with almost no dialogue for long stretches. The reaction was not the triumph the studio had hoped for. A number of viewers were baffled. Some walked out. Reports from the premiere described confused, restless audiences and a wave of negative early reactions, with one studio executive said to have called it a disaster. The film's star, Keir Dullea, later recalled that nothing important was actually removed in what followed. No scenes were deleted outright, he said. They were simply shortened. But Kubrick, watching his audience, had clearly decided that the film was testing their patience. And unlike almost any other director, he was in a position to do something about it even after the film had already opened. What Kubrick did next is extraordinary. Rather than leaving the film as it had premiered, he sent out detailed instructions to cinemas specifying exactly which pieces of the film to trim. Projectionists and theater managers physically cut the prints to match his notes. In total, he removed around 19 minutes. He was, by every account, a perfectionist who fine-tuned his films to the last possible moment, and sometimes past it. This was not a studio forcing changes on a reluctant director. This was the director himself, having watched a real audience, deciding the film was too long and tightening it himself after it was already playing in theaters. The version almost everyone has seen ever since is this shorter cut. The longer premiere version effectively vanished within weeks. The cuts were spread across the film. Shots were trimmed from the Dawn of Man sequence at the beginning. A section of an astronaut exercising aboard the spacecraft was shortened. Part of a spacewalk was tightened, along with several other small moments. None of it changed the story. These were trims for rhythm, not deletions of plot. But there is a fascinating detail that is often forgotten. While Kubrick was cutting, he also added 3 small things. He inserted a brief shot of the monolith into the famous early scene where an ape works out how to use a bone as a tool to help the audience connect the two ideas. And he added 2 now iconic title cards: Jupiter Mission, 18 months later, and Jupiter and Beyond the Infinite. Those captions, which feel like they were always part of the film, were in fact added after the premiere to help baffled audiences follow the timeline. For decades, the question was, where did the cut footage go? The grim assumption was that it was gone. Kubrick had a documented habit of destroying material he did not want reused, and many believe the trimmed minutes of 2001 had simply been burned. Then, in 2010, a remarkable claim surfaced. Douglas Trumbull, the visual effects pioneer who had helped create the film's groundbreaking imagery, revealed at a screening in Toronto that the footage had been located. It had survived in what was described as perfectly preserved condition inside a vault in a salt mine in Kansas, the same kind of climate-controlled underground archive used to protect priceless film and television material. 17 minutes of cut 2001 footage, long feared destroyed, were sitting safely underground. The footage was not lost after all. It had simply been buried. So why has none of it been released? The answer came from Warner Brothers, which holds the film today. In a statement, the studio explained that the additional footage had always existed in its vaults, and that when Kubrick trimmed those minutes after the premiere, he made it clear that the shortened version was his final cut. The film, the studio said, is exactly as he wanted it preserved, and they had no plans to expand or revise his vision. This is where the story splits into 2 fair points of view. Film preservationists and many fans would dearly love to see the recovered footage, even as a separate curiosity. But Kubrick's own stated wish was unambiguous. The trimmed film was the finished film. His family have said he was adamant the cut material was never to be seen. A director has the right to decide the final form of his own work. And so the footage stays in the vault preserved, protected, and deliberately unseen. The lost footage is not the only thing 2001 erased. There is an entire orchestral score for this film that almost no one has ever heard. Under pressure from the studio, which wanted an original soundtrack, Kubrick hired Alex North, a celebrated composer who had scored Spartacus for him 8 years earlier. In January 1968, North composed and recorded around 40 minutes of music for the first part of the film. He worked hard, and he believed in it. But as Kubrick edited, he kept returning to the classical recordings he had been using as temporary placeholders. Quietly, he decided to abandon North's score altogether and keep the classical pieces instead. The cruel part is how North found out. Nobody told him. He learned that his entire score had been thrown out only when he sat down at the New York premiere and heard someone else's music playing over every scene. North reportedly believed, to the end of his life, that his score was the right one and that his work had been quietly discarded. What replaced North's score is now inseparable from the film. The slow, majestic docking of a spacecraft set to Johann Strauss's The Blue Danube Waltz. The thunderous brass of Richard Strauss's Also Sprach Zarathustra over the film's most famous images, the eerie, floating voices of György Ligeti around the monolith. These were never written for 2001. They were existing pieces of classical music that Kubrick had dropped in as a guide while editing and then simply never replaced. Kubrick later explained his reasoning bluntly. However good the best film composers are, he said, they are not Beethoven or Mozart or Brahms, so why use lesser music when so much great music already exists? Alex North's rejected score did eventually surface. In 1993, the composer Jerry Goldsmith recorded it in full, finally letting the public hear the version of 2001 that might have been. It is, by any measure, a fine score. It is also a ghost, the soundtrack to a film that no longer exists. There is one more piece of 2001 that was filmed and then removed, and this one really is lost. Kubrick wanted the film to feel scientifically credible, so before the main story, he shot a documentary-style prologue. In it, around 20 leading scientists, including the British astronomer Bernard Lovell, were interviewed on camera about space travel and the possibility of intelligent life beyond Earth. It was filmed in 1966, but the finished film was already long, and Kubrick decided the prologue had to go. It was cut entirely before release. Unlike the salt mine footage, this material does not appear to have survived, as the prologue itself is considered lost. What does survive is the transcript of those interviews, later published in a book. Read today. Some of the scientists' predictions about habitable worlds elsewhere in the universe feel strikingly ahead of their time. An entire opening to one of cinema's greatest films gone, except for the words on the page. Kubrick's instinct to erase the unwanted parts of 2001 went further than footage. The film's spacecraft, sets, models, costumes, and props were among the most detailed ever built. The work of model makers, engineers, and designers who had created a believable future from scratch. When filming ended, Kubrick reportedly ordered almost all of it destroyed. The reason, by most accounts, was simple and very Kubrick. He did not want any of his unique designs turning up cheaply in other people's films, so the props were broken up and scrapped. One famous, beautiful model of the space station is said to have ended up in a rubbish dump. The irony is sharp. Because so little survived, the few genuine 2001 props that exist are now among the most valuable in cinema. One shuttle model later sold at auction for over $300,000. Kubrick tried to make sure his future could never be reused, and in doing so, made the fragments of it almost priceless. For all that Kubrick removed, the single most famous moment in 2001 is something he kept and it is one edit. In the Dawn of Man sequence, an ape, having just learned to use a bone as a weapon, hurls it triumphantly into the air. The bone spins upward against the sky, and the film cuts instantly to a spacecraft drifting in orbit millions of years later. In a single frame, the story leaps across the entire history of human technology, from the first tool to the spaceship. There is no dissolve, no caption, no explanation. It is widely called one of the greatest cuts in film history, sometimes described as the longest flash forward ever made, jumping 4 million years in a fraction of a second. And remember, it was during the very same round of post-premiere editing that Kubrick added the brief shot of the monolith just before this moment. The most analyzed edit in cinema sits right beside the footage he chose to erase. So, what is the 2001 we actually have? It is the shorter version Kubrick locked in days after the premiere, about 140 minutes, the cut he called final. The 19 or so minutes he removed survive in a salt mine vault, preserved but unseen, kept that way out of respect for his wishes. Alex North's rejected score survives as a separate recording, the soundtrack to a film that was never released. The documentary prologue survives only as a printed transcript. And most of the physical film, the ships, the sets, the models, survives only in a handful of rare, scattered pieces. Kubrick died in 1999, still regarded as one of the most exacting filmmakers who ever lived. The film he left behind is celebrated as a masterpiece. But it is also, quietly, a film defined as much by what he took out as by what he left in. 2001, A Space Odyssey is remembered as a perfect, unalterable monument, a film that seemed to arrive fully formed. But it was shaped, after it opened, by a director cutting his own work in front of a confused audience. An entire score was thrown away. A prologue was erased. The props were destroyed. And 19 minutes of it sit, to this day, in the dark of a salt mine, preserved, protected, and chosen never to be seen. Not banned, not lost, set aside by the man who made it. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe to follow The Missing Frame as we keep uncovering the lost cuts, buried footage, and hidden truths behind the films that changed cinema.